King Jr.
On Tuesday, April 3rd, 1968, Dr. King spoke at the Mason Temple Church of God in Christ in Memphis, Tennessee, where 1,300 sanitation workers were on strike against companies for their unfair labor practices and treatment of workers. Dr. King came to Mason Temple to speak to the sanitation workers and their supporters. This would be Dr. King's first front in the struggle of the Poor People's Campaign, an effort by him and the Southern Christian Leadership Council to gain justice for poor people in the United States, and at the age of 39, Dr. King's last public address before his assassination the following day, Wednesday, April 4th, 1968.
Thank you. And thank you kindly. You know, when Brother Ralph Abernathy was doing that kind and eloquent introduction, I had to think to myself, well, who was he talking about? It's so good when your closest friend says something good about you. And Brother Ralph Abernathy is the best friend that I have. I'm delighted to see all of you here today. Despite the storm warning that is out, you reveal that you are determined to go on anyhow. Something is happening in Memphis. Something is happening in our world. If I was standing at the beginning of time with the possibility of getting a panoramic view of human history up to this point, and the Almighty said to me, Martin Luther King, which age would you like to live in? I would take my mental flight back to Egypt, across the Red Sea, through the wilderness, on to the Promised Land. But I wouldn't stop there. I would go on to Greece, to Mount Olympus, and see all the great thinkers, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Euripides, discussing the totalities of life. But I wouldn't stop there. I would go on to the heyday of the Roman Empire and see various leaders and emperors. I also go on to the Great Renaissance and see all that the Renaissance has done for the aesthetic of man. But I wouldn't stop there. I would even go by the man for which I'm named. And I would watch Martin Luther as he tacked his 95 Theses on the door of the church at Wittenberg. But I wouldn't stop there. I would come on up to 1863 and watch a president by the name of Abraham Lincoln vacillating on the issue of whether he should sign the Emancipation Proclamation. But I wouldn't stop there. I would come on up to the early 30s and see a president grappling with the problems of bankruptcy of his nation and hear his most eloquent cry. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. But I wouldn't stop there. I would turn to the Creator, to the Almighty, and I would say, if you would allow me just a few years to live into the second half of the 20th century, then I would be happy. Now that's a strange thing to say. Our nation is sick. The world is messed up. Problems everywhere. Confusion all around. But I know, and I know, that only when it is darkest can we see the stars. And I can see God working in this time. Something is happening. Something is happening in our world. The masses of the people are rising up. And wherever they are assembled, whether they are in Johannesburg, South Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, Atlanta, Georgia, Jackson, Mississippi, and here in Memphis, it's always the same. We want to be free. Now, another reason that I'm happy tonight is that we have been forced to a point where it is no longer a question of nonviolence versus violence. It is a question of nonviolence versus non-existence. If the colored peoples of the world are not brought out in a hurry from the long years of suffering, neglect, and poverty, then our entire world is doomed. I'm just happy that God has allowed me to be here in Memphis with you on this day. And I'm glad that He's allowed me to see what is unfolding. I can remember a time when Negroes were going around, and as my brother Ralph Abernathy would say, scratching where they did not itch and laughing when they were not tickled. But those days are over. We mean business now, and we are determined to gain our rightful place on God's earth. What we are saying is that we are people. What we are saying is that we are men and women. And what we are saying is that we don't have to keep living the way that we have been forced to live. Now, what does this all mean? Well, it means that we must maintain unity. You know, whenever Pharaoh wanted to prolong slavery in Egypt, he had a favorite formula. Do you know what that formula was? He kept the slaves fighting each other. But whenever the slaves would start to get together, something would happen in Pharaoh's court. And that was the beginning of the end of slavery in Egypt. So let us maintain unity. The other thing we must do is to keep the issues where they belong. The issue is injustice. The issue is the refusal of the city of Memphis to treat its public servants fairly and honestly. In this case, 1,300 sanitation workers who are on strike. Let's keep attention on that. Now the newspaper only likes to mention the fact that a few windows were broken. They never got around to the fact that 1,300 sanitation workers are on strike because their employers are not treating them fairly with regard to hiring practices and labor practices and other policies. Let's keep attention on that. And let's keep attention on the fact that God's children in Memphis are suffering. These men are on strike, and some are going without food to feed their families and are in financial difficulty. So let's keep attention on the striking sanitation workers. And when we march on Monday with the sanitation workers, we need all of you. We need all of you. We need all of you there. And we're not going to let any mace stop us. I can remember when we were in Birmingham, Alabama, and our majestic struggle there. And the sheriff in Birmingham was named Bull Connor. Some of you may have heard of him. And old Bull Connor put the dogs on us. Said, put the dogs on. And we just went in front of those dogs singing, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. We didn't let no dog stop us. And then old Bull Connor said, well, put the fire hoses on. And he put the fire hoses on. But you see, old Bull Connor didn't know history. Bull Connor knew a kind of physics that didn't relate to the kind of transphysics that we knew. And that's the fact that there's a kind of fire that no water can put out. You see, we knew water. Get that amen in here. We knew water. If we were Baptist, we had been immersed. We knew water. And those of us who were Methodists, they'd been sprinkled. They knew water. And even our Catholic brothers and sisters who marched with us, they knew water too. We didn't let no water stop us. And so then we just went on before that fire hose is singing, up above my head, I hear freedom in the air. And then old Bull Connor said, well, throw them in the paddy wagons. And he threw us in the paddy wagons. And old Bull Connor said, take them to jail. And they took us off to jail. And they put us in those paddy wagons, had us stacked in there like sardines in a can. And we just went in that jail singing, we shall overcome. And while we were there, we saw how the jailers were influenced by our words, our prayers, our songs. We had a power there in that jail that old Bull Connor couldn't adjust to. And so we ended up transforming that old bull into a steer. And we won our struggle in Birmingham. We need to go just like that here in Memphis. And I call on you to be with us when we march on Monday. Now, about these injunctions. These injunctions that they're using to try to prevent us from marching on Monday. We are going to court tomorrow morning, and we are going to fight these illegal, unconstitutional injunctions. If I lived in China or Soviet Russia or some other totalitarian nation, then maybe I would understand these injunctions. Maybe I would understand the denial of basic First Amendment privileges because they have not committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of the press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right. So just as I said before, we didn't let any mace, and we didn't let any dogs, and we didn't let any fire hoses, and we didn't let any paddy wagons, and we didn't let any jails turn us around. We're not going to let any injunctions turn us around. We're going to move on. And we want you to move on with us when we march. And you know what's beautiful to me? You know what's so beautiful to me today to see all the ministers and the deacons who are gathered here with us. Somehow the minister must be like Amos when he says, let justice roll like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I'm so glad to see all the ministers and deacons in the house today. I would thank all of you individually, but time does not permit. But I want you, the rest of you, to thank these ministers that are here because so oftentimes ministers are not concerned about anything but themselves. I always appreciate a relevant ministry. You see, it's all right to talk about the long white robes over yonder. But ultimately, people want some suits and some dresses and some shoes to wear down here. It's all right to talk about the streets of gold flowing with milk and honey. But God's preacher has been commanded to talk about the slums down here, the shanty towns and the homeless shelters and the people living in their cars and the ones who can't get 3 square meals a day. It's all right to talk about the New Jerusalem. But one day God's preacher must talk about the New York, the new Philadelphia, the new Washington, D.C., the new Indianapolis, Indiana, the new Jackson, Mississippi, the new Atlanta, Georgia, the new Nashville, Tennessee, the new, what's that town straight up I-65 north, about an hour north of Nashville? Bowling Green, the new Bowling Green. And of course, the new Memphis. And I'm so glad that God has allowed me to be with you here today. Now, the other thing we must do is this, and that is to anchor our nonviolent activity with the power of economic withdrawal. Now, we are a poor people. The Negro in America is a poor people. Compared individually to white America, the Negro in America is a poor people. We are poor. But did you know that the combined income of Negroes in America is the 9th largest nation in the world? Did you know that? After you take out the rest of the United States, Soviet Russia, West Germany, France, Great Britain, I can name the others, the Negro in America is the 9th richest country in the world. Did you think about that? In 1967, Negroes represented $30 billion in income. Now that's power, if you know how to pool it. So we don't have to argue with anybody. We don't have to go around cursing and acting bad. We don't have to go around throwing bricks and bottles. We don't need any Molotov cocktails. All we need to do is go around to these stores and to these massive industries and say to them, God has sent us by here to tell you that you aren't treating his children right. And God has sent us by here to tell you that you can make the first item on your agenda fair treatment. Now, if you do not accept that agenda, then we have an agenda of our own. And that agenda calls for withdrawal of economic support from you. So what we want you to do is to go to your neighbor and tell them this. Tell your neighbor not to buy Coca-Cola products in Memphis. Tell your neighbor not to buy seal test milk in Memphis. Tell your neighbor not to buy Wonder Bread in Memphis. Tell your neighbor not to buy, what's that other company, Brother Jesse? Heart's Bread. Tell your neighbors not to buy Heart's Bread. Up to now, only the garbage men have been feeling the pain. And as Brother Jesse said, we want everybody to share in the pain. And understand, we are choosing these companies because they refuse to treat their employees fairly with regard to hiring practices and labor practices and so forth. And they can begin the process by treating these workers fairly and justly and acting upon their needs and rights. But not only that, we need to strengthen our black institutions. So I call upon you to take your monies out of the downtown banks in Memphis and deposit them with the Tri-State Bank. We want to create a bank-in movement in Memphis. We've had protests and marches and dine-ins and sit-ins. Now we want to create a bank-in movement in Memphis. There are 6 or 7 black insurance companies in Memphis. Take out your insurance with those companies. We want to create a insurance in Memphis. These are the kinds of things that we must do. So as I come to a close, you know, I've noticed all the years I've been preaching that every time I utter those 3 magical words, as I come to a close, or as I conclude, everyone sits up in their seats and everyone pays attention. So as I conclude, we've got to finish this struggle in Memphis. We can't stop now. We've got to see it through. And when we march on Monday with the sanitation workers, we need you to be there. Think about your brother. You may not be on strike, you may not be a sanitation worker, but either we go up together or we go down together. I'm reminded of the man who fell among thieves on the road to Jericho. If you remember, there was a Levite and a priest on the road that day, and they came up on the man and passed him by. But then another man came, and we call that man the Good Samaritan. Does anyone here know that? The Good Samaritan came up, administered first aid, helped the man. And then Jesus ended by saying the Samaritan was the good man because he helped his brother. Now, we use our imaginations to try to explain why the priest and the Levite did not stop. Well, there's some that said that the Levite and the priest were on the way to prayer meeting that night in Jericho and couldn't be late. Well, now there's some that said that the Levite and the priest were on the way to choir practice and that there was a law in the land that said you couldn't touch another human being 24 hours before the choir practice or 24 hours after the choir practice. There's even some that said that the Levite and the priest didn't want to be embarrassed for helping this old filthy beggar on the side of the road and didn't want word to get back to Jerusalem. I even heard another one say that the Levite and the priest were on the way to a fish fry in Jericho in order to raise some funds for the sick and the shut-in, and had to get to Jerusalem to show some people how to fry some fish. I even heard somebody say that the Levite and the priest were awfully hungry and had to get to Jericho in order to go to a homecoming to get them some gospel word. Well, let me tell you what my imagination tells me. It is possible that the Levite and the priest were afraid. You see, the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was a twisting, winding road. It's very conducive to ambush. They tell me that you start out 1,200 feet above sea level in Jerusalem, drive 15 or 20 minutes later, and you are 2,200 feet below sea level in Jericho. That's a very dangerous road, very conducive to ambush. And in those days, they tell me that it was known as the Bloody Pass. So when the Levite and the priest came up and saw that man, they thought that maybe that there were other robbers around. And they were afraid if they helped him, that they might get robbed. Or maybe the priest and the Levite thought that the man himself was faking and wanted to jump upon them and seize them in order to take what they had. So the first thing that the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But then along came that good Samaritan, and he reversed the question. He said, if I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? And that is the question before all of you this evening. The question is not, what will happen to me if I stop to help the sanitation workers? The question is, what will happen to the sanitation workers if I do not stop to help them? So let us move on with greater preparedness and greater determination in this day of challenge. And let us move on in this time of challenge in order to make our nation better, our country better. You know, several years ago, I was in New York City signing, autographing my book. And I was sitting there autographing my book, and this demented black woman came up. And the only thing I heard her say was, "Are you Martin Luther King?" And before I knew it, she stabbed me. She stabbed me. I was rushed to the Harlem hospital. It was a cold Saturday afternoon, much like this one. And when I got in the hospital, the x-rays revealed that the tip of the blade was resting on my aorta. Now, the aorta is the main artery. If it's punctured, you bleed, you drown in your own blood. That's the end of it. Well, the next day, it came out in the New York Times that if I had merely sneezed, I would have died. So, a few days later, after the operation, after my chest had been opened up and the blade removed, they let me whirl around the hospital in a wheelchair. And as I was in the wheelchair, I started receiving mail. There was mail coming to me from all across the nation, from all across the world. And there was one letter I will never forget. I received a letter from the president and the vice president. But I don't forget what their telegram said. I received a visit and a letter from the governor of New York. Now, I don't remember what the governor said, but there was one letter I will from a 9th grade student in White Plains, New York. And she wrote in the letter, she said, "Dear Dr. King, I'm writing you as a 9th grade student from White Plains High School. While it should not matter, I am a white girl. And I just wanted to say that I was reading in the newspaper about your misfortune and your suffering. And the newspaper said that if you would have sneezed, you would have died. And Dr. King, I'm just writing to tell you that I'm so happy that you did not sneeze. And I'm here to tell you this evening that I'm also happy that I did not sneeze. Because if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been here in 1960. When colleges was all across the South, in Greensboro, in Nashville, started sitting in lunch counters because what they were really doing was standing up for what is great. What they were really doing was stand up for the best in the American dream. And taking our country back to those wells of democracy dug deep by our forefathers in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. If I had sneezed. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't be here in 1962, when Negroes in Birmingham, Alabama aroused the consciousness of this nation and brought into being the Civil Rights Bill. If I had sneezed. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been here later that year in August, when at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., I delivered a dream that I had to the American people. If I sneezed. If I sneezed, I wouldn't be here in 1965 to see over 100,000 blacks and whites, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics gather on the Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, and march some 50 miles to the state capitol in Montgomery, the cradle of the Confederacy and the former capital of the Confederacy, which brought into being the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which all of you enjoy and take advantage of today. If I had sneezed. And if I had sneezed, I wouldn't be here in 1968, gathered with all you rallying around our sanitation workers who are on strike. I'm so happy that I did not sneeze. And they were telling me that it really doesn't matter now. It really doesn't matter now. We started this morning in Atlanta. We got on the plane. There were 6 of us. And as we're getting on the plane, the pilot came on the public address and said, he said, "We are sorry for the delay, but Dr. Martin Luther King is on board. And to ensure our safety on this flight, every bag and every piece of luggage has been checked. And all the operations of this airplane have been tested and validated. And furthermore, to ensure our safety, this plane has been guarded and watched all night to ensure our safe journey to Memphis." And then we get here to Memphis, and they begin speaking about the threats that were out. Concerns about some type of terrorist activity that might happen with me from some of our sick white brothers. Well, I don't know what's going to happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind. Like everybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He has allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight